Our reading this week comes from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew himself what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as many as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, and they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got in a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But Jesus said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him onto the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. So when Jesus saw the crowd who was gathered around him, what was the question that he asked his disciple Philip? "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus knew the question was about the people, wasn't if the people should be fed. In Jesus' mind, the only question was how the people would be fed. Again, like we have seen with Jesus healing people and casting out demons, Jesus is full of compassion for the people before him. And he took action to demonstrate that love and compassion. And the answer to how the people would be fed is through a boy. This week in our Bible study, one of the participants invited us to consider this story from the perspective of this young boy. In her mind, she created this story about the boy and shared it with us. The boy was probably sent by his parents to go to the market to pick up some things for the family's meal that day. He was probably on the young side, but old enough to go on his own to the market. He successfully got the bread and fish that his mom wrote on the list for him to get. But then he got caught up in the crowd. Everyone in the market had been talking about this Jesus guy. He had been performing miracles, healing people who had been sick for decades. He had been casting out demons, and he had been teaching some bizarre but hope-filled things. Pretty soon, word spread like wildfire around the market that Jesus was nearby. The shopkeepers and the shoppers alike quickly abandoned their tasks. With excitement and curiosity and haste, all of the folks from the market started to walk towards where they heard Jesus was. The young boy, eager to witness Jesus for himself, allowed himself to get swept up with the moving crowd. And so the boy found himself with the crowd gathered around Jesus. When Jesus challenged his disciples to feed the crowd, Andrew noticed the boy holding the barley loaves and the fish. I don't know if the boy thought twice about giving Andrew the food he had gotten for his family with the only money they had for that day. But the boy's 5 barley loaves and 2 fish ended up in Jesus' hands. Now imagine the perspective of the boy at this point. With all he had heard about Jesus, at this point, the boy attentively watched Jesus to see what he would do. Pretty soon, those thousands of people who had gathered were sitting down, eating a feast. And he watched in awe as the people filled all their bellies, and then the disciples picked up basket after basket of leftovers, all because of this boy's bread and fish. And then the boy ran home. He was empty-handed, but his mind and belly and soul had been filled by what he had just witnessed and experienced. This miracle of turning scarcity into abundance. I hope his parents weren't too disappointed or harsh with the young boy. I hope they were able to appreciate the miracle that their boy got to be part of. Or maybe the disciples sent the boy home with one of the baskets of leftovers, and maybe the family feasted that evening. A young boy. He was innocent, weak, vulnerable. He had not yet been corrupted or tainted by brokenness of the world. He had no power and no social status. It was completely unexpected that it was through a young boy that Jesus fed 5,000 people. Yet that's what Jesus did. The boy gave all that he had, and Jesus involved him in perhaps the most well-known of Jesus's miracles. Jesus did the unexpected through an unexpected person. This miracle happened when the food was shared by the boy. Jesus gave thanks, and then the disciples shared what they had. And the result of this sharing was there was more than enough. The scene began with a perception of scarcity. There was apparently no place where they could buy enough food for all those people. And even if there were a place, not enough money to buy even a crumb for all of those people. And the few loaves and fish certainly wouldn't have been enough to give everyone a small bite. But the fear of scarcity became the joy of abundance. In the end, there was more than enough. And I wonder what unexpected thing Jesus might do through an unexpected group of people like us. And I wonder what might happen if we all shared what we had like this young boy. What fear of scarcity might be transformed into the joy of abundance. We as a congregation do have an abundance physically and spiritually. A while back, the church council brainstormed all the resources that we as a community of faith have. We made lists of our physical and financial assets, our people assets, and all the assets we have in connection with this community and the Synod and the ELCA. And we made some long lists. We have an abundance physically in this building. So much space where so much good for our community could happen. We have an abundance in financial resources, so much money in savings and in our mission endowment fund. And we have an abundance in our people resources. All of the people connected to this congregation with their life experiences, their skills, and their passions. We have an abundance in our growing connections to community organizations and through all the resources available through our Synod and through the broader ELCA. And we have an abundance spiritually. So much good news. Consider all the grace and forgiveness that we have received. Consider the hope that we know because of God's promises. Reflect on the way that your life has been transformed by being part of God's family, by knowing that you are a beloved child of God. And think about the impact that this church community has had in your life. We've been given so much spiritual blessing. And ultimately, all these gifts have come from God. And God has entrusted all of this into our care, the physical and the spiritual gifts. So how might we share these gifts? How might we find ways to share all that God has given to us? The young boy with the bread and the fish didn't know everything. He didn't know what might happen to his family if he shared their meal that day. He didn't know what Jesus could possibly do with the meager offering of a few loaves of bread and 2 fish in the midst of 5,000 people. He didn't know why he was seemingly the only one who had food. But he trusted Jesus enough to be willing to share what he had. And that's what we are invited to do, to trust in Jesus, to continue to deepen our relationship with Jesus so that we might more fully and deeply trust in Jesus. And one way that we live out that trust is by sharing what God has given us, sharing our physical and financial blessings, and sharing our spiritual blessing. We share what we have so that people's physical needs might be met, and along the way, their spiritual needs will be met too. Through this whole passage, Jesus challenged his disciples. He pushed them to put their faith into action. Jesus wanted to see if what he had been teaching his disciples was finally beginning to stick. But even more importantly, I think Jesus wanted the disciples to see for themselves that they could live out their faith. With Jesus' help and presence, they could do this work that Jesus had entrusted them to do. And so can we. We can trust in Jesus. And because of this trust, and because of our relationship with Jesus, and because Jesus is always with us, we can do this work of sharing what we have been given. We can do this work of living out our faith. So may we lean into trusting in Jesus so much that we will find how to feed people in need, physically and spiritually. And when we do, may we discover the abundance that comes with sharing. Let it be so. Amen.